recording of this event, as this has been requested by various people, and we're more than happy to do that. Okay, welcome everybody tonight, this morning, this afternoon, this evening, wherever you are. It gives me great pleasure to be introducing Professor Christopher Gill. Chris's work is, for those of us who work in ancient philosophy, for many of us, it's been a touchstone for some years. He's worked on ideas of ancient selfhood. He's worked on ideas of ancient philosophy and what we would call psychotherapy. He's the author of, I think, really landmark studies, including Personality in Greek Epic, Tragedy and Philosophy, which is literally an award-winning book. The Structured Self in Hellenistic and Roman Thought. Naturalistic Psychology in Galen and Stoicism. And the book we're about to discuss, which was published, in fact, last year, which is Learning to Live Naturally, Stoic Ethics and Its Modern Significance. So it gives me, it's fantastic to have you here, Chris, and to be discussing this book. But without further ado, I will pass the floor over to you. The floor is yours.
Okay. Well, many thanks to you, Matthew, and to Judy for setting up this book launch, and to everyone else who's here for sharing in this discussion. So I'm going to share screen, and I've got a sort of summary of my talk. Where is it? There it is. Okay. So I'll be just reading my paper, but when I've stopped, I'll be more visible and taking part in the discussion. Okay, so I'm starting things off with a very brief outline of the book's content, and then by explaining my main aims in writing the book. By the way, is the volume okay for everyone? Good, okay. The book is divided into three parts. The first part discusses the core distinctive ideas of Stoic ethics. These center on the relationship between virtue and happiness, virtue and indifference, and the role of the idea of nature in Stoic ethics. The second part of the book focuses on Stoic ideas about ethical development or learning to be virtuous and happy. The main topics here are the Stoic ideas of development as appropriation or oikoiosis and emotional development, two topics that are very closely linked. The third part explores the significance of the Stoic ideas discussed in the first two parts for modern thought. I focus on the implications for modern virtue ethics, environmental ethics, and practical life guidance of the kind I'm also involved in. So the three parts of the book explain the book's title. Living naturally is the Stoic conception of happiness. Learning refers to ethical development, and the modern significance is centered on the areas just mentioned. So why did I write this book? Well, it's an academic book. It's designed primarily for other scholars and students of Stoicism, but it's also, I hope, accessible to anyone who wants to make a thorough study of Stoic ethical ideas. Incidentally, since writing the book, I've also written, together with Brittany Pollard, another book on Stoic ethics with a broader audience in mind that I hope will be published reasonably soon. However, in this book, what I wanted to do, above all, was to bring out both the power of Stoic ethics and its credibility and coherence, both as a theory and as a basis for living. Stoic ethics centers on a series of claims that are strong, but also challenging or paradoxical. For instance, that virtue is the only thing that is really good, and that all other things are relatively matters of indifference, or that all human beings have the capacity to achieve happiness by developing virtue, or that happiness is a matter of living a life according to nature. So these are strong, strong claims. What I've tried to bring out by close examination of these claims and the ancient texts which set them out is that they're credible and coherent in several important ways. They make sense at the theoretical level. They stand up to scrutiny and criticism. They're also credible at the psychological level. They also express a compelling and rich conception of what it is to lead a good human life, including our life as engaged and caring participants in interpersonal and social relationships, a side of Stoic ethics that's sometimes overlooked by scholars and sometimes too by enthusiasts for the Stoic life. So let me develop this view in connection, first of all, with a line of thought that runs through the first three chapters. The idea that virtue is a kind of knowledge or expertise, namely expertise in living a happy life. What is the content of this expertise? Partly, it is expertise in what the Stoics call selecting between indifference. The Stoics maintain that things often considered good in life, such as health, wealth, even the well-being of family and friends, are not good, but matters of indifference compared with virtue. Now, this doesn't mean that such things have no value. For Stoics, as well as for everyone else, they have a positive value. They are indifference because they do not make the difference between happiness and its absence. Well, what does make the difference? What makes the difference is virtue, the four cardinal virtues as an interdependent set, which enable us to discriminate between indifference and to decide what to go for ourselves and for others in any given situation. The process of decision-making, of selecting between indifference in line with our understanding of what the virtues involve, is examined in Cicero's On Duties, and it's discussed in chapter 2 of my book. One crucial factor in this kind of decision-making is selecting in a way that goes towards living a happy life, in the sense of a life according to nature, which is one of the standard Stoic definitions of happiness, eudaimonia. But what does this mean? What sense of nature is involved? Well, sometimes when the Stoics talk about the life according to nature, they mean according to human nature. This is, for instance, what it means in Cicero's On Duties. And what does this imply? Human nature is defined in Stoicism, typically, as a combination of rationality and sociability, a combination that distinguishes human beings from other animals. So the happy life is, in part at least, the life that enables us to develop our rational and social capacities to the highest possible extent. The Stoics also sometimes analyze the happy life as the life according to universal nature, that is, the natural world, which the Stoics identify with immanent God. What it means to live according to nature in this sense has been much debated by scholars, and it's a debate I discuss in chapter 3. The meaning that I stress in my book in chapters 1 and 3 is that there are shared or analogous features in the natural world and in the life of a virtuous person. And the happy life, according to nature, in this sense, is one that expresses those shared features. There are two principal features. One is the combination of structure, order, and wholeness, or overall consistency. The other is, at the cosmic or universal level, the expression of providential care by nature providential care by nature as a whole. At the human level, it is expressed in caring both for ourselves and other people in the best possible way, an idea linked especially with the idea of development as appropriation. These two accounts, human or universal, of what it means to live a life according to nature are different, and they sometimes occur separately in Stoic texts, but they're also compatible and can be mutually reinforcing. So overall, the happy life is one in which we select between indifference rightly or correctly with expertise, and that means selecting in a way that brings about a natural life. That is, a life that best expresses our human nature as rational and sociable, and does so in an ordered and structured way that best expresses care for ourselves and others affected by our actions. This account of virtue as expertise, which obviously I'm just sketching here, is strong and credible in the ways I suggested earlier. It's philosophically coherent and it's fully worked out. Also, when it's fully explained, it's psychologically credible and it provides a strong basis for a worthwhile life. It's also one that, in several ways, underlines the importance of living as an engaged participant in interpersonal and communal relationships. In these senses, I think the Stoic conception of virtue as expertise offers a powerful framework for living as well as for theory. A similar general point can be made about Stoic ideas on ethical development. My second main subject in the book, the main subject of part 2. These ideas are closely linked with the ideas about virtue and happiness discussed in the first part. Here too, we can identify a single strong claim that all human beings as such have the natural capacity to achieve happiness as understood by the Stoics through developing the virtues. That is, by acquiring expertise in living a good life. What underlies this claim? It's partly the belief that all human beings have the cognitive capacity to understand ideas such as virtue and happiness. We also have two kinds of inbuilt natural dispositions to care for ourselves and to care for others. Another underpinning belief is that ethical development is a fundamentally human or natural capacity. It does not depend on having a special kind of family or social background, or a special kind of intellectual education. Also, it can occur in contexts and activities that form an integral part of virtually any human life, such as making practical decisions, selecting between indifference, and forming relationships with other people. This is part of a universalist approach that is characteristic of Stoicism rather than some other ancient and modern ethical theories. How does ethical development occur in the Stoic view? The Stoics give special attention to two ideas, which are themselves closely linked. One is the idea of development as appropriation, oikoiosis. The Stoics think that it is natural for us as human beings, as rational and sociable animals, both to appropriate ourselves and to appropriate other people. Appropriation means making something one's own. We appropriate ourselves in the Stoic view by developing our natural capacity for forming virtue, And we do so by learning how to select properly between indifferents such as health, wealth, and the well-being of our family and friends. This is also the way in which we realize our natural disposition to take care of ourselves as rational and sociable animals in the best possible way. And in this way, if the process of development reaches its conclusion, we learn the true value, the goodness of virtue as the only basis for happiness. This is one strand in the pattern of appropriation described by Cicero in On Ens 3. The second strand is appropriating others, or expressing our natural disposition to care for other people. The most obvious form of this natural disposition is parents' care for, just a minute, just trying to shift this down. Not sure how this goes down. Perhaps it will. Right, let's stuck on that for a minute. Might have to get technical help on this, getting this thing down.
What's happened, Chris?
I just need to go from the first page to the second of this, or the lower part of this, page 2. Oops, mouse isn't doing this.
Chris, I think there's a right hand on the right hand side. There's a line on the right hand side of the screen. If you select that and bring it down, I think it will go down.
Right hand side of the line.
Yeah. Move your cursor to the right. Right, still to the right, and there's a line on the very edge of the window. The very right hand side of the window. There's like a thick line, and if you bring that down, there, just up a little bit, bring that down.
Okay.
Thank you, Tim. Thank you.
We always need a psychotherapist on hand.
Really welcome. I'm there myself.
So, the second strand, So a full course of development, yes, the most obvious form of this. I was talking about the second strand. It's not quite on the screen quite, but anyway, the second strand of appropriation is appropriating others, or expressing our natural disposition to care for other people. The most obvious form of this natural expression is parents' love for their own children. The most obvious form is that. But in a full course of development, this enlarges into a more fully developed set of relationships with other family members and friends. It also develops into full and engaged participation within our community, as well as the recognition that all human beings, as rational and social animals, form a larger community, and one that is in some sense integrated with the natural world as a whole. Although Cicero in On Ens 3 describes these two strands separately, it's clear that both in theory and lived human experience, they need to be combined and integrated to make up complete ethical development. That is, we need both ethical understanding and an ability to relate properly with other people. These two strands are also conceived as ways of developing our capacity to lead the life according to nature. That is, a life in accordance with the best features of human nature and the natural world as a whole. So Stoic ideas about appropriation are closely linked with those about virtue and happiness, as discussed in part 1 of the book. A third strand of development is emotional development. Stoic ideas about emotion have often been criticized as unrealistic or inhumane, but in recent years, some Stoics have brought out the richness and complexity of Stoic thinking on this subject. The Stoic ideal is not to become free from all emotions altogether. It is to become free of defective and misguided emotions, emotions based on the mistaken belief that what is good and what really matters in human life is gaining or losing indifference. But the Stoic ideal is also to experience good emotions, such as well-wishing and joy, which depend on a correct understanding of what really matters in human life, that is, virtuous expertise in living. In my discussion of this topic in chapter 5 on emotions, I stress that Stoic thinking on this topic centers on ethical development, which is also emotional development. I stress the connections between emotional development and the two strands of appropriation, progress in ethical understanding and in our relations with others. The change from experiencing passions to having good emotions depends on making progress in these two other kinds of ethical development. So the Stoic therapy of emotions is not just a matter of emotional self-management. Rather, it's a byproduct of ethical development. I also aim to challenge the impression sometimes formed that the Stoics aim to gain peace of mind through detachment from other people. On the contrary, ethical development for the Stoics consists in part in the formation of ethically well-guided relationships, and this, in turn, forms the basis for emotional peace of mind. Thus interpreted, the Stoic theory of emotions forms an integral part of a complex and powerful set of ideas about ethical development. And Stoic ideas about development, like their thinking on virtue and happiness, brings out the combination of a coherent and challenging theoretical framework and a strong basis for living a happy life as an individual and as an engaged participant in relationships. Now, Stoic ethical theory has its own intrinsic force, and that's what I've tried to bring out in the first two parts of the book. Also, in part 3, I explore 3 areas where Stoic ethics can make, or has already made, a significant contribution to modern thought. The first 2 are theoretical, though they have practical implications, and the third is practical. A notable feature of modern ethical philosophy is the revival of theory based on ideas of virtue and happiness. Aristotle's ethics has been the main influence here. However, I argue that in various ways, Stoic ethics offers an alternative or better paradigm for modern thought. In particular, Stoic thinking on the relationship between virtue and happiness and virtue and indifference offers a compelling account of key concepts for modern virtue ethics, virtue and happiness. And the Stoic account avoids certain ambiguities and tensions or loose ends which are present in Aristotle's theory. Aristotle's theory has often been seen as particularly strong in the central role that it gives to philia, to interpersonal bonding in ethical life. However, as I've stressed here and in my book, the social dimension of Stoic ethics is also very strong, though it's differently conceived from Aristotle. I suggest especially that the Stoic idea, fundamental to the theory of appropriation, that we're equally disposed by nature to care for others as for ourselves, offers a compelling alternative both to Aristotle and to modern ideas about egoism and altruism. There's a further point of contact between Stoicism and certain modern virtue ethical theories, which stress the close interconnection between ethics and our understanding of our nature as human beings. I'm thinking of thinkers like Philippa Foot and Rosalind Hursthouse. As noted earlier, in some versions of Stoic ethics, a very close link is made between virtue and happiness and human nature, conceived as distinctly rational and sociable. The same is true, again, it has to be said, of Aristotle. However, as in other respects, the points of connection between ideas of human nature, virtue, and happiness are more fully worked out in Stoic theory. For instance, the theory of appropriation is potentially a strong contributor to modern naturalistic virtue ethics. Stoicism also sometimes emphasizes the ethical significance of universal nature, or the natural world as a whole. And this gives scope for Stoicism to contribute to another aspect of modern theory, namely environmental ethics. I suggest that Stoicism offers a visionary and conceptual resource which can help us grasp the full scope of the threat of climate change and global warming, and to respond appropriately to this threat. The Stoic worldview recognizes that the natural world is not only valuable for us, human beings, but has intrinsic value. Indeed, for them, it has goodness, like the goodness of virtue. The Stoic worldview links the goodness of the natural world with certain features, order, system, stable patterns and interconnections between different aspects of nature, features that are precisely the ones which are put at risk by climate change and global warming. This adds an extra layer of significance to the reasons we already have for giving environmental action the highest possible priority in our personal and political lives. A further feature of Stoic ethics that renders it especially relevant for environmental ethics is that virtue and happiness are sometimes framed in terms of the relationship to nature as a whole, as well as human nature. Hence, the idea of making a very close linkage between acting virtuously and acting and achieving happiness and establishing a proper relationship with the natural world is built into Stoic ethics in a very fundamental way. Thus, the notion that ethics involves not just taking care of ourselves and other human beings, but also exercising a kind of stewardship for the natural world as a whole, is one that forms a very credible and natural extension of Stoic ethics. Finally, I turn to the substantial role that Stoic ethics has already played in providing a basis for modern life guidance, as well as for certain strands in modern psychotherapy. As I've stressed here, Stoic ethics does not only offer a coherent and compelling theoretical framework, it also provides a rich and complex basis for living. Features of special value for this purpose include the twofold stress on exercising care for yourself and also for other people. They also include the coupling of a focus on virtue and happiness with a powerful set of ideas about human nature and the natural world as a whole. Also relevant for life guidance is the Stoic theory of development. This stresses the idea that all of us have the scope for developing virtue and happiness, and that this does not depend on a special type of social or educational background. Thus, learning to live naturally is open to all of us, and this provides a universalizing framework for guidance in living. Sorry, I have to try and get this tiny bit more text if I can. This mouse sort of has a will of its own. I can do it now. Come on. No, there's just a few words more on the bottom. Okay, more specifically, I discuss my own involvement in modern Stoicism with its distinctive activities of an online Stoic course, Stoic Week, and this is on at the moment. Stoic Week is on at the moment, and I think it's not too late to join. Is it, Tim? I think people can still join.
People can still join, yes. They'll be a little bit late in the show, but you can still join.
Yeah, well, we'll fit you in somewhere. Yeah, an annual conference or Stoicon, and a continuing blog of articles called Stoicism Today, for which Judy Stove here is associate editor. Another organization I'm involved in is the Aurelius Foundation, which has similar aims to modern Stoicism and has some special focuses, especially on work in prisons. As I stress in my book, many of the most familiar and well-loved Stoic exercises in our courses are based on ancient writings, such as those of Epictetus and Marcus, which aim to present the Stoic ideas I've reviewed here in a form that lend themselves to practical living. This is true, for instance, of the exercise of the dichotomy of control, of expanding the circles of our concern for other people, and the view from above. These are all ideas that can be linked with the theoretical ideas that I've talked about. So Stoic Week and the other activities in practical or applied ethics serve as a means of opening the door to the powerful framework of ideas that I've set out in my book and outlined here. So thanks very much for your attention, and I'll be interested to respond in due course to comments and questions and so on. So
thank you very much, Chris. We can all, I guess, react virtually through the reaction function, but I think that's obviously a fantastic summary for people who might be new to the work. And I know that Judy is also going to explore particular aspects, and notably the importance of Cicero to what you're describing. But for those who don't know Judy, to transition to our first respondent, as Chris has indicated, she is co-editor of Stoicism Today. She's principal mover behind Melbourne Stoicon-x, let's be honest. And she's also writing a book, I believe I can disclose this, on receptions of Marcus Aurelius. But today she's going to be obviously giving a response to Chris's book. And so, Judy, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Nat. It's a privilege to have been asked to take part with Associate Professor Matthew Sharpe and with Professor Gill himself in this panel. The book will surely be the definitive account of Stoic ethics for the foreseeable future. Okay, I'm just trying to advance my slides, but that's not happening right now.
Tech.
Nope, that's not happening. So I'll just stop share and see if I can start again. Okay, let's try one more time. Here we go. The book will be the definitive text on Stoic ethics for the foreseeable future. It is detailed, thorough, taking Stoic ethics seriously in all its aspects, which is an approach less common than one might suppose, tackling head-on the most challenging of problems with diligence and care. So detailed and comprehensive is the work that I cannot undertake anything like a survey. I shall focus on one of the ancient authors treated as central, Cicero. Professor Gill's stimulating book has done for me what great works of scholarship should always do: send us back to the primary texts with, to adjust Seneca famously from another context, with fresh eyes, spectatrix nova. As Professor Gill has done with vast erudition and dexterity, we are obliged, in the relative paucity of our sources, to consider Cicero as a primary guide to Stoic theory as it stood in his lifetime. But this inevitably raises questions. What were Cicero's projects in conceiving and producing De Finibus in 45 BCE and a year later, De Officiis on duties? Clearly, the works vary widely in structure, style, and purpose. In De Finibus, Cicero writes alternately as other protagonists and then in propria persona as an academic skeptic. In the later work, the entirety is presented as a didactic letter to Cicero's son. Yet we know that the origin of at least the earlier parts of the work was an explicitly Stoic one in Panaitius. Was De Officiis Cicero's last word on the matters? As fate decreed, it would be the latest one which survived from his pen. Obviously, I'm not in a position to offer any but questions here. In any event, how fortunate we are that Professor Gill has restored On Duties as the central source it must be. For decades, it has languished relatively neglected. The speeches, the letters, De Fin, Tusculan Disputations, De Natura Deorum, and Academica, nay, even De Divinatione, have been more studied perhaps than De Officiis. What a falling off was there of this book, which was the third to emerge from the Gutenberg press, which was the Manual of Princes, which was, Voltaire wrote, the most useful treatise that we possess in morals. We don't even, I would say, have a very good translation for the title. Duty, of course, has been out of vogue for at least since the 60s. Appropriate roles, perhaps, or as Professor Gill translates on page 72, appropriate actions might better suit both key senses of officia and of our times. In any event, it's very exciting to have this work restored to centre stage. Now, Professor Gill rightly focuses on Cicero's account as being entirely coherent with the evidence from the early Stoa in Diogenes Laertius, Book 7, in its emphasis on two key aspects of human life, the rational and the social. In fact, a third key aspect is actually primary, the situation of humans as part of the animal kingdom, possessing, as do our animal relatives, a set of instincts, hormi, impetus. First of all, that towards self-preservation, and then to reproduce and to care for the young. The implications of this triple framework are profound, and Cicero draws out important threads. Family life introduces a productive cycle of sociability, the pursuit of excellence, and the exercise of virtues. Now, this is a natural history, reinforcing the Stoic insistence that to live virtuously is equivalent to ison esti, live in accordance with the experience of the actual course of nature, as we are told that Chrysippus wrote in his work on ends. Professor Gill also underlines that the multiple processes here are dynamic. The progress of appropriation, described in De Finibus, Book 3, quote, shows this process leading in one strand to the complete development of virtue and happiness, and in the other strand to the expression of virtue in relationships with other human beings of different kinds, who are recognized as being our own or of our kind. Cicero also, Professor Gill points out, includes a naturalistic account of the development of the four cardinal virtues as observed in practice. To quote Cicero's explanation, from the full perception, perspicientia, of the truth or the ingenious consideration of truth, this is wisdom, or from the protection of people's communities while treating each person appropriately and ensuring fairness in transactions, well, what is that but justice? Or from extraordinary heart, invincible greatness and strength, that's courage, or with order and regularity in regard to both actions and words, the essence of appropriate and disciplined behaviour, of course, that's self-control. And once again, this is no ivory tower projection. Cicero's Stoicizing account is firmly based in an assessment of how human communities and individuals, at their best, as a matter of fact, behave. Professor Gill also points us to a parallel discussion in De Finibus 2, where Cicero, and this time in propria persona as himself, is claiming against the Epicurean assertion that humans, as a matter of observed fact, pursue pleasure and avoid pain as a primary motivation, insists that the best people do many things without a view to advantage, but simply because the actions are right. And brilliantly, in my view, Professor Gill goes on to suggest that Cicero presents each of the virtues as having two aspects. The first, a core quality, the second, adding an other-directed theme. And this, he suggests, may reflect Honidius' own emphasis. But the natural history of virtue brings us to one of the knottiest problems in Stoic ethics, the indifference. Now, as Will Johncock has said in another connection, Stoicism is a philosophy of seeming contradictions, and the identification of paradoxa stoicorum is a genre of perennial appeal. Professor Gill, however, undertakes to present the Stoic viewpoint as both consistent and psychologically credible. And here, on all fronts, once again, Cicero turns out to be key. Good health, riches, children, if these fall to our lot, then we readily consider them as things for which to be grateful. But what kind of value do these occurrences have, particularly if virtue is the only good? What is it for them to be, as we are told the early Stoa pronounced, both indifferent and yet in the class of the preferred? Alla diaphora cat eidos proegmen, as we're told Chrysippus, among others, said. On the one hand, Cicero, once again in propria persona, in De Fin Book 4 this time, has a field day exerting the full force of his rhetorical disdain and even enrolling absent friends against the apparent inconsistency. Our friend Marcus Piso was often witty, but never more so when he ridiculed the Stoics on this score. What, he said, you tell us that wealth is not good, but you say it is preferred, propositum in Latin. How does that help matters? Does it diminish greed? In what way? If it is a question of words, well, to begin with, preferred is a longer word than good. Ouch. But if we depart from the polemical context and return to a focus on nature, part of the problem simply goes away. Professor Gill explains that as humans develop, ideally we pursue those occurrences which help best to realise our nature as human beings. Such things promote our nature as rational and social animals. And this is most readily seen, perhaps, in the prime example of good health, which almost by definition must be a factor in that most fundamental of drives, that to self-preservation and the drive to communal life. Why do we try to eat healthily and exercise? Because we believe with reason that this will help extend our lives, better enabling us to support our families or at least be less of a burden on them. That's in our nature at its best as loving family members. What we may be doing here further is making the right use of the indifferent of good health, a concept, as Professor Gill reminds us, laid out by Plato in the Euthydemus. In theory, a tyrant in flourishing health might employ it in the persecution of others, but a virtuous person or one aiming at virtue will by contrast spend time accorded by her health in helping her community. But some uncertainty persists about how we should understand the value of indifference. Did the Stoics, when it suited them, maintain two standards, goodness and value? They claim not. Professor Gill cites two scholars, Rachel Barney and Tad Brennan, as suggesting that the Stoic virtuous person would, or at least might, maximise her stock of preferred indifference. Professor Gill does not see this as plausible. Rather, he writes, in seeing on a broadly Socratic model virtue as a form of expertise, we might see the virtuous person as selecting correctly between indifference. And here, once more, Cicero returns to centre stage, because what he spends much of De Officiis on is the weighing of the good and the advantageous, the honestum and the utile, against a background always conscious of nature. Consideration of the indifference is likely to feature in every decision we make in ordinary life, but the consideration of what is right will be central. Cicero also offers insights into the thought processes of a person who has an ethical decision to make. An important factor is going to be represented by relationships. And this again links back into our nature in our communities. Thus, Professor Gill can argue, the presentation of practical deliberation in On Duties does not support the split-level analysis of Stoic decision-making sometimes offered, in which the agent gives attention only to specific factors without reference to broader considerations. Most significantly, it is the exercise of virtue which can ensure that indifference, whether preferred or dispreferred, contribute to a good life overall. But this is not to suggest that every disagreement is going to be settled even among Stoic authorities. Professor Gill points to the famous disagreement outlined by Cicero in On Duties, Book 3, between Diogenes of Babylon and his student and successor Antipater, both scholarchs at Athens, about the responsibilities of a person selling a product. Should he or she disclose everything about the product to the potential buyer, or only some aspects? After all, buying and selling products seems to be something which comes readily, we may say naturally, to humans. Antipater maintained that the seller was obliged to tell all to a potential buyer in view of the, quote, the bonds of social unity which nature has ordained among men. But Diogenes responds, but these bonds are not such that a man may not have anything to call his own. If that is so, there is not even any selling to be done, only giving. Business ethics, such a thorny area. Importantly, the person considering a course of action will need to take into account shared human nature as rational and sociable, but also our own abilities and roles. Above all, we need to try to harmonise all our roles. An assessment of indifference will be required when we wish to determine how the generous and fair-minded person will proceed. Virtue will always be the priority, above all, in avoiding injustice to other people. But relationships, social settings, habits, and personalities will all be taken into account. This is not to undermine the Stoic ethical viewpoint. Rather, What Cicero seeks to do is to provide a practical handbook for putting virtuous decision-making into practice. And I just point to an interesting book from 2021 by Jack Viznik called The Invention of Duty, where he seeks to reconstruct a kind of Stoic decision tree, also largely on the basis of on duties. Stoicism was and is a philosophy of living in the world, not retiring to the garden, except where otherwise obliged. Above all the ancient schools, it recognized our situation as embodied agents in the world, including our particular human world of families, groups, polities, businesses. Athens was the location of the philosophical schools, but Rome was where young men returned after their student days to compete for places in the law, the army, and politics. While Roman society did include prominent cynics, any practical guide to life in Rome had to take account of such indifference as social support and approval. And Cicero, as Professor Gill shows us, declares that in such a social context, the virtuous is the advantageous. It is pleasing, it attracts others, offering a role model, a living exemplar of how to act. For because the very thing we call right and fitting, decorum, pleases in itself and moves the heart of all by its nature and appearance, shining out brightly, so to speak, from the virtues that I've mentioned. Because of that, when we think people possess these virtues, we are compelled by nature to love them, quoted on page 88. In Professor Gill's careful treatment, we can see Cicero as a reconciler of the seeming conflicts involved. Let me conclude by touching on one other problem which seems to emerge in Stoicism, that which recognizes that, again, as embodied mortal beings, we and everything around us are subject to constant change. Seneca writes that even as he writes in letter 58, he is in the process of alteration. Yet we are to aim to be consistent throughout all, to pursue the consistency of the wise person, Constantius Sapientis. How is that possible? Perhaps we can reconcile this seeming conflict. If we wish to be serious, and this adjective spoudaio is very important, students of Stoicism, we will examine our own lives for opportunities to improve our decision-making, while recognizing that circumstances will always be in a state of flux. We aim to harmonize ourselves with nature. Assisted by reading, discussion, study, reflection, we can hope to avoid being those lightweights, so often excoriated by Seneca, people of no predictability or principle. After all, as Professor Gill reminds us, Stoicism, in contrast to some Platonist or Aristotelian views, offers the prospect of ethical improvement for adults. With this in prospect, as we attempt to respond with resilience to events which challenge us, an indispensable guide on our journey must now be Christopher Gill's Learning to Live Naturally. Thank you.
Thank you, Judy. Thank you so much. Okay, we have one more respondent, which would be myself. I am also a little bit aware of the time, and it's 50 minutes past. So I have a paper that would probably take between 17 and 20 minutes to read, and I'm inclined not to fully read it. Also because some of the points have been very ably covered both by Chris and by Judy. What I will do is share my screen, and I'll just aim to present for something around 10 to 12 minutes, and that way we'll have the full hour for people to engage with Chris, and also for Chris to engage with Judy's responses and what I'll have to say as well in terms of interpreting his work. So here we go. I'm going to try and share my screen. Okay. We've all done this so many times over the last however many years. Can people see? Oh, it's not a Zoom. It's not a Zoom forum. Although we could really talk about the Greek word zoe, I suppose, in this context. My apologies. It ought to be a Zoom forum. Can people see my screen? You can tell that was the last thing I wrote. Excuse me very much. Excuse me very much. This is about living naturally. Okay, so what am I going to talk about? This is what I'm going to talk about. I want to talk about one of the subject areas that Chris raised that he's intervening in the third part of his book, which is modern virtue ethics, which is I think it's emerged as one of the sort of paradigm approaches to understanding what is called normative theory, or philosophical morals. So Kantianism, the philosophy of Immanuel Kant, which argues that we are rational creatures and that there's something called the categorical imperative that we should apply in all situations of moral decision making. The second paradigm is utilitarianism, which again suggests there's an all-purpose rule that we can bring to any situation of personal or practical or moral decision making, namely, I should make the decision that is going to maximize the amount of pleasure that is produced foreseeably by my decision. So those two paradigms of moral theorizing were really the kind of main games in town until the 1970s, the 1980s, into the 1990s. You had a group of thinkers associated with figures like Bernard Williams, Elizabeth Anscombe, Philippa Foot, Rosalind Hursthouse, all of whom Chris mentions and engages with in the context of his book. These figures began to, as you've heard, turn to Aristotle and say, well, there's something pretty abstract about this way of thinking about moral philosophy, about decision making. You know, we've got this kind of isolated rational agent just being asked to make a decision about what they're going to do. We don't know about their history. We don't know about their ethical development. We don't know about their character. Often the situations they're responding to are more or less thought experiments concocted by philosophers in seminar rooms, whereas in real life, as we all know, we're all complex agents with different histories and biographies, and situations are complex. We've got competing duties, competing considerations intervene, and all of that. And so they begin to say, well, we need to go back to Aristotle. We need to go back to Aristotle, and what we're going to be doing is what they call virtue ethics. And that is an approach to questions about value, which suggests that we shouldn't be starting with isolated agents deciding on right or wrong and applying various theorems and so on. We should be looking at characters. We should looking at life histories. We should be looking at real people, and we should be looking at ethical development. And Aristotle's the guy, they think, that uniquely gives us an account of what it is to be virtuous, how that happens, what the virtues are, and so on. Now, I think what Christopher is pushing back against is precisely this idea that if we're going to go back to virtue ethics, that Aristotle would be the necessary kind of destination that we're going to arrive at. And so I just present this quote from a humanist, an Italian humanist in the Renaissance, to show that this idea that, you know, if you're going to return to Greek ethics to try and resolve issues around morality and so on, Aristotle hasn't always been considered to be the place to go. In fact, in the Renaissance, Cicero, who we've heard about, and the Stoics, followed by the Epicureans, are always a bit more edgy in a Christian format. These were the moral philosophies that people went back to, the ethical philosophies. So, for example, Manetti says in his Life of Socrates, even though Aristotle knew perfectly well how to define and differentiate the different virtues, he provided nothing so that we can seek virtue more assiduously or liberate ourselves more stubbornly from the vices. On the other hand, Socrates and Plato, amongst the Greeks, and then there's Cicero and Seneca, of course, a Stoic, they knew how to inspire people, even those who sleep or who are occupied with other things, to nearly unbelievable love of virtue and hatred of the vices. So I think the contemporary return to Stoicism is not unprecedented in the context or in the history of kind of rethinking the history of Western ethics and what might work for us and what might be utilizable by people who aren't necessarily just interested in academic scholarship, but also interested in what Chris calls life guidance. So with that much said, if Stoicism is a kind of paradigm we can go back to if we're looking for virtue ethics, is it any good that I think is what Chris's book, I think, really trying to present a powerful counter to the idea that Aristotelian ethics is the kind of unique and most appealing way we can revive ancient virtue ethics. That is the theory that says, or the approach that says, that we should be talking about the cultivation of forms of virtue, of dispositions of character, which are admirable and which will enable the people who have them to live well. As I've said, there are other paradigms. Stoicism is one of them, and Chris's book, I think, is really suggesting that, well, if virtue ethics is going to be the new game in town, perhaps it has something to say in terms of addressing potential problems with the Aristotelian position, and in terms of perhaps being able to go beyond what the Aristotelian position might be able to offer people today. So the first thing I think Gill's book does, Chris's book does, is to suggest that the very paradigm of virtue ethics that people like Philippa Foot and Rosalind Hursthouse are presenting as superior to, as I've said, these more abstract modern moral philosophies about right and wrong decision making, the various formulas that we might apply. So he argues that Stoicism shares all of the decisive features that Foot and Hursthouse find attractive in Aristotle. And so here's, I think, an illustrative example. So Rosalind Hursthouse is a New Zealand virtue ethicist. She says that if we look at the advantages of virtue ethics over something like a Kantian approach, the idea that we just make decisions and we need to apply this formula called the categorical imperative, and we need to test our maxims against this formula, and then we'll get a result, which is either an act is permissible or not. She says, well, the approach of virtue ethics in Aristotle tells us that human beings are social rational animals, as you can see there. Ideally, we'll cultivate the virtues, which will be good making for them. They will enable them to flourish as the means to pursue 1, individual survival and flourishing, 2, the procreation of the species, 3, characteristic freedom from pain and enjoyment, and 4, the good functioning of the social group, and ultimately the wider human species. Now, in effect, I think what Gill's book does is to suggest, well, if that's what we're after, an approach to virtue ethics that is going to present that this kind of understanding of what virtues, as it were, can do for us in terms of our flourishing, then Cicero's Cato, as we've heard, and the account of Stoic ethical development or appropriation is pretty much precisely what Hursthouse is rediscovering through reading Aristotle. The next point then, I think, is to elaborate a little bit, and I'm taking a little longer than I expected, my apologies, on this issue that Chris has raised about inconsistencies in Aristotle. And so broadly, you can see the propositions that might be in contradiction that Christopher suggests. Stoicism is not going to fall into like consistencies about. So Aristotle tells us in Book 1, Chapter 7 of the Nicomachean Ethics, that the good for human beings is an activity of the soul in accordance with virtue. However, he's already indicated in an earlier chapter, and he continues to indicate in a later chapter in Book 1, that nevertheless virtue is not enough for a good life. And Christopher, I think, quite rightly points out that for a virtue ethics by title, and just in itself, this presents a prima facie inconsistency. But for the Stoics, as we've heard, virtue is the only good. And although it is preferable, it is preferable to have health, it is preferable to have wealth, it is preferable to have good reputation, these things are not decisive, as I think Christopher's importantly said. I think this is a great formulation. They don't make the difference. Everybody who has those things is not happy. Everybody who doesn't have those things is not necessarily thereby unhappy either. And this is a kind of observation by Socrates that the Stoics point to say, well, what does make people happy is a certain expertise in living well. And if you have it, you're going to be okay no matter what happens, and you're going to flourish as well as you can, whether you happen to fall into good fortune or not. Now, the second inconsistency you can see there is this inconsistency in Aristotle books 1 to 9, suggesting that the best way of life will be that of what is sometimes characterized as the civic virtues, the virtues that most of us would recognize, like moderation or courage. And then in book 10, he turns around and says, oh, by the way, the best way of life for human beings, in fact, it's nearly divine, and it perhaps is effectively divine, would be to live a wholly theoretical life, a wholly contemplative life. But this has caused a great deal of anxiety amongst commentators who find the idea of a theoretical contemplative way of life implausible, and enter into various interpretive strategies to try to make Aristotle not say that, if you like. And Christopher is able to point out, well, the Stoics just don't ever say that in the first place. They argue that the best way of life will involve forms of reflection and the fullest development of our rational and social capacities, but it will in no way implicate or direct us towards any kind of withdrawal to pursue a scholarly or Stoic life. Couple more points, and then I will finish. I thought by not reading I would go more quickly. There you go. In fact, it's turned out not to have worked at all. In any case, the fourth and fifth points I was going to make are these. Firstly, that if we are interested in a form of virtue ethics that would be more available, more attractive, more interesting, more normatively appealing to moderns, we should probably be reconsidering Stoicism again rather than Aristotelianism. You will not find in Stoic texts problematic passages about the alleged lack of rational capacity of natural slaves or of women, for example. And as Chris has pointed out, there is an emphasis on ethical education, which points to the idea that any human being, beyond a certain age at least, will be able to develop their rational capacities such that philosophical and ethical education will be available to them. And there are very clearly passages in Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics where he does suggest that early childhood development, early life development within certain contexts is absolutely decisive, and that if a person doesn't receive a certain level of ethical development in the context of their relatively early life, then philosophical reflection won't really be able to be much help. None of that is present in Stoics. Final point, as you can see, Stoic decision-making, the last point that is often made against Stoicism, it would be to suggest that it's over-formulaic, a kind of proto-Kantianism. And I think Gill's book is really, really important for highlighting, on the back of Christopher's engagement with modern forms of a Stoic life guidance, the extent to which actually, as people are voting with their feet about, Stoicism seems to provide a lot more practical advice in terms of what Seneca might call precepts, broad rules of thumb to guide conduct, such as the dichotomy of control: what's in my control, what's not in my control, the distinction between impulses and what we assent to, the idea of the sage as someone we might want to think about how would they respond in various situations. There are a whole series of these kinds of practical models and directions that Stoicism gives that don't seem to have direct equivalents in Aristotelian ethics. And I've just put a quote up there, which I think really shows you what Chris is able to bring out. And again, we've heard that Cicero is particularly important in all of this, in terms of just a sense of what a Stoic model of decision-making, far from being abstract and inhumane or anything like that, it's actually quite nuanced. And Christopher is drawing on this notion of the four personae that comes from Panaetius and Cicero relates to us through De Officiis. We've got the general dimension that we should take into account, of which we've heard a good deal about our shared human nature and how we might fit into wider nature. And then we have three other kind of roles that we ought to also try to coordinate, as Chris identifies. We've got each of us has individual proclivities, talents, and so on. And they're important in terms of thinking about who we might want to be and what we might want to decide to do. So they are our individual talents. So we have individual talents, we have inclinations, we have personal style, we have a given or inherited role in society. That's also important. Deificus, what might that mean? Of duties, maybe of obligations, another unfashionable word. And the role of the life project that we can choose if we have the scope for doing so. Cicero's guidance, far from, again, I would say being abstract or anything like that, focuses on the idea that people in making long-term or short-term decisions should try to be consistent between these kind of fourfold claims. And I think it's quite a, at once, concrete set of frameworks. It's also very psychologically realistic, as Chris has stressed. At the same time, it falls short of, here's a set of rules, you can just follow them. You're going to have to fit yourself into each of these four roles. And there'll be no one universal answer about what any one of us should do, given the considerations that they each embody. So that's what I wanted to say in terms of why I think Chris has made a really strong case that academic virtue ethics really ought to take Stoic virtue ethics or Stoicism as a virtue ethics perhaps more seriously than it has. And there we go. There's the Doric columns of Corinth, and I am finished. Thank you. We have, therefore, a little bit over 50 minutes. So what I'm going to do from here is I'm going to stop my share momentarily. So that should enable us all to be seen. And I'm going to invite people to raise a hand, or is it better and more efficient, in fact, to get people to put things in the chat?
That might be better, I think, Matt.
All right. So if you have a question, can you just indicate in the chat, just say question or something like this, and your name will come up. But while you do that, Christopher, Chris, do you want to offer any kind of preliminary thoughts or responses to anything that either Judy or I has presented up to this point?
Well, I mean, just thank you again for everything you've said. You've said some very nice things, but anyway, that's the important thing, is that you've said things that really matter, are important, and that's great. So no, I just think it's quite interesting that both of you in different ways have sort of emphasized the role of Cicero as a source for Stoicism, and especially on duties. And that is one thing I wanted to bring out in the book, because I think one of the problems with Stoic ethics a lot of the time is people say, well, where is it? What should we read? It's easy with Aristotle. You just go and buy a copy of Aristotle's Ethics. Stoicism is much more difficult. The sources are, many of them have been lost. We're reliant on indirect works, or you've got these late works like Epictetus and Marcus that are very much themselves dependent on earlier works. Cicero gives you a clear exposition of Stoic ideas, and he compares and contrasts them with other ancient theories. And so there you do have in the On Ends 3 is a wonderful overview of Stoic ethics, and on duties is a wonderful example of how to put it into practice. So I think it's a really good resource and something we should make more use of. I mean, Epictetus and Marcus, they're wonderful in different ways, but if you really want to see a sort of more intellectual approach, a more sort of philosophical approach, I think Cicero is a very good window. Of course, he has his own axe to grind sometimes, but it's usually pretty clear when that's happening. Yeah, so that's the only thing I wanted to say. So, but thanks again.
Thank you, Chris. I can see that Stefan, and welcome, has a question. So Stefan, do you want to pose a question?
Yes, I have a question, especially for Christopher, but of course all the others can join in answering it. And my question concerns the topic of learning to live naturally. We have this famous distinction in Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics that virtue is acquired by didaskalia, by teaching, and by ethos, by habituation. Christopher, would you say that the Stoics share this thought? Is there a more theoretical dimension and a more practical dimension in Stoic virtue acquisition? Or would you say that such a distinction is false, or different? So that is my question, basically.
Yeah, well, that's a big difference between the two approaches. Yes, for Aristotle, first of all, and in childhood, that's why he places such stress on childhood. There's and Plato does the same too in the Republican Laws. So for them, it's a two-stage process. First of all, there's a kind of habituation in beliefs and attitudes and emotional inclinations. And that's why they lay such stress on having the right family or the right society. You know, if you don't have that initial habituation, then things get you're kind of lost, really. And then separately, quite separately from that, you have the idea of an intellectual education. For Plato, it's a lot of it is mathematics, but for Aristotle, it's more analytic reflection. Now, the Stoics just don't look at it that way at all. For them, they don't want to separate out these dimensions, and indeed, they don't think that we can be kind of habituate. Virtue isn't the kind of thing. It's a skill. So it's an expertise. So how are you going to acquire it? Well, you acquire it through living, and that may have a habituative element, but habituation can't do it because it's a matter of understanding. It's understanding all the way through, and so that's that's of course why they say that children can't have the virtues. They can't, because they're not rational. They're not fully rational. But as you become adult, you acquire the means, you have the resources, rationality, and indeed sociability. You're developing your sociability, and so with those things, you can then learn. So I think Stoicism, and I think people haven't always fully seen just how different the Stoic view is on this. They really do want to get away from that two-stage pattern towards a more single pattern, and I think it is a very important feature. And that's why in oikeiosis, although there are two strands, there's only one line, as it were, in each case. You don't have preliminary process of habituation and then irrational end development. I mean, one of the problems with the Aristotelian and the Platonic one is, how do the two bits fit together? I mean, it's often quite hard to see, and in fact, they don't actually always fit together. So, but the Stoics the Stoics are holists. They're lumpers rather than splitters. They put things together, and so learning is a unified process, a holistic process that carries with it emotions and so on. Yeah, does that help?
Yeah, that helps. Thank you.
So Eric asks, what brought each of the contributors to Stoicism, and how do they see it developing in modern times? Christopher, do you want to lead off?
Yeah, I've come to, yes, people often say this. Well, actually, I've just studied it. I mean, for me, it was just studying. I studied ancient philosophy for many years. Over the years, I became more interested in, and I've studied many aspects of it, but I became more interested in ethics. In fact, for years, I did a course on third-year course on Greek and Roman ethics, including Aristotle, Epicureanism, and Stoicism, comparing and contrasting the three ethical approaches and what they had to offer. And gradually, I did become more interested in the, as it were, real life aspect of this. But my involvement in applied Stoicism came in a way partly accidentally, because I wrote I was working on Marcus Aurelius, who is of course a great exponent of the Stoic life, and I needed to organize as part of the grant which I had to organize a workshop on this. And then, and through that, I was introduced by a graduate student of mine to people like Tim LeBon, Donald Robertson, and so on. All these people who are working on the more applied, practical side of Stoicism. So rather towards the end of my professional career, I became aware that there was this whole dimension of applied Stoicism, and so my approach was slightly accidental. Now I realize it has immense value for living, and of course it has a value that one doesn't always realize. I mean, I think it was probably part of my experience earlier than that, but I've only been more really conscious of the practical aspects in later years. So what about the others?
Do you want to address Eric's question?
Oh, sure. Yeah, so I've always been interested in Latin and classical Greek, and curiously, just around the start of the pandemic, I rediscovered Seneca, and around the same time realized, as Professor Gill was talking about, that there was this whole world of, well, a whole community out there. And I think the pandemic accelerated people's interest and appreciation for Stoicism in confronting times. And certainly my interest and involvement has just grown and grown over the past, I would say, 3 or 4 years. So now I find myself in the fortunate position of being able to take part in discussions like this. It's just wonderful. Matt?
Yeah. Oh, it's a long story, but yeah, I discovered Marcus Aurelius at a certain point, and it was certainly a kind of philosophy that I think I'd been looking for. That I'd come through a PhD program, and I guess I hadn't really found it. I'd always been interested in the way that philosophy can I guess affect everyday life, and perhaps it's the infamous practicality of the Australian spirit. I was always like, well, if it can't, what good is it? And it was, I don't know, I had the experience that this is what I'd been looking for a long time, and I still love Marcus Aurelius, and I still think that it's a wonderful book. And I'm a Marcus and Epictetus person. I'm trying my best with Seneca. I'll continue to try, but that Marcus and then Epictetus were my introduction into Stoicism, and then, like Judy's described, I guess at a certain point I became aware that, wow, I've actually become interested in something that other people are becoming interested in, which is rare for an academic, and that there's this enormous community that's growing, including through Chris and Tim, who's here as well, in terms of the modern Stoic phenomenon. And so, yeah, that's really, I guess, what brought me to where I am with Stoicism right now. So yeah, that's my answer, I guess, to that question. But while I've been answering that, and before, there are a couple of others that have emerged. Christopher Nylander has asked a series of questions, in fact, all of which are very philosophical. So they're keeping us on our toes. Are not most decisions subconscious? And if so, what impact might that have on how we might develop wisdom and the virtues? And then there's a couple of questions about the nature of wisdom, but I think, well, first of all, this is something that often comes up with I think, criticisms of Stoicism, which is that it seems to imply that we have conscious control of all of our conduct, at least in principle. And isn't this a problem? Because aren't most of our decisions, or many of them, are determined by subconscious factors? So what's your take on that, Chris, on that issue?
Well, of course, these are claims, aren't they? I mean, you perhaps Christopher might not agree, but these are that our actions are guided by subconscious. That is itself, a claim which one could contest. But it's interesting. I mean, the Stoics actually never talk about conscious. They never draw the distinction between conscious, unconscious. They're not. It's not. That's much more important in modern philosophy. What they're interested in is the assumptions that which may not be conscious, but they think we have, as it were, embedded beliefs. These are what some people sometimes call cognitions. I mean, the Stoics also, in some sense, believe in cognitions. They believe that we have a sort of range of assumptions or factors, or what they call hormai, motives, which are present in us, whether or not we are articulating them. So what we're doing when we act is we're acting in the light of our sort of perhaps unconscious belief structure, and it's the actions which show that. I mean, Epictetus highlights this. Well, you say that you're following virtue, but actually it's perfectly obvious you're interested in money, and so and you're self-interested, or you're acquisitive or lustful. So your actions, and then Epictetus does this quite often. He points at people, his students, and he says, look, you say you're interested in asceticism. Well, actually, you're only interested in dressing up and looking beautiful. That's obvious from the way you behave. So the Stoics, and they think that's our actions are, betray, they express what we really believe. So they're not. Whether or not we consciously articulate them is another matter. But they also then believe that we can, that we can bring them to consciousness. We can make efforts. We can make conscious efforts to articulate these beliefs. Where Epictetus talks about examining our impressions. We all have impressions. We act on the basis of impressions. Well, we can examine these impressions. Now, we may not. It doesn't mean we're not necessarily infallible in doing it, but this is something, this, as human beings, it's part of human rationality that we have the capacity to do this, and so there's an access to the, if you like, the unconscious assumptions, or the assumptions, whatever they may be, which motivate us. Now, I don't think the Stoics would necessarily claim that at any given moment, our understanding of the full range of assumptions we have is total, that we have a 100% understanding of that. But they think that we have resources. We can, there's certain methods or practices that we can use to do that, and that's something within our power. Yes. So is that something of a response, Christopher? They're pre-Cartesian. It's Descartes who introduced this great focus on consciousness. Consciousness there's no actual word for consciousness, the conscious, unconscious. It's what makes us act. So I think that's what they're interested in. What makes us feel, what makes us act.
If I can maybe add something to that, and Epictetus in particular, and Marcus as well, I guess, remind us all the time that we're not going to have access to other people's motivations. Other people's motivations are going to be opaque to us. So in that sense, from that point of view, I don't think the Stoics would really interest themselves in whatever other people's, as you might say, subconscious motivations might be, simply because we are never going to have access to that. All we have access to are their actions and how they are in the world. Epictetus says something like, there's no point of speculating about why somebody did that thing. it seemed good to him. That's why he did it. So in a sense, there's an absence of curiosity about other people's motivations simply because we don't have access to them. All we have access to, as Chris has just said, is actions in the world.
Matthew, you're mute.
You're mute. Matthew, you're on mute.
Excuse
Okay.
me. I was just saying, Krista has another couple of questions concerning wisdom and whether it might be a good umbrella term for all the virtues and inner capacities. In a similar way, he asks, that the word knowledge is used for structured information. So I guess, what is the relationship, or your understanding of that relationship between wisdom and the other virtues? Can it also be learned, he asks. Just the small questions tonight, Christopher.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. I mean, I think the idea of the unity of the virtues is a very interesting one, and it's very important. And of course, another way of putting that is that all the virtues are forms of wisdom or forms of knowledge. So they're all forms of wisdom. So whereas Aristotle, of course, will say, there's one kind of thing over here, which is, intellectual wisdom, and there's something else over here, practical wisdom. Well, they won't. They say, it's wisdom. Wisdom is a unitary thing, and it informs all aspects of our living and our thinking. If we acquire a logical way of thinking, then that will shape the way we act. It will have joined up living. We don't just have joined up thinking, but joined up living. So I think the unity of the virtues is a very powerful idea for them initially. And yes, just to give one sort of example of that. I mean, so they would want to say, you might say, oh, well, no, that's wrong. We can be courageous without being wise. But they would challenge that. I mean, how can to be courageous, you've got to know what's worth risking your life for. Okay, you've got to have good judgment about what it's worth risking your life for. If you don't have wisdom in their sense, ethical understanding, then you might risk your life unnecessarily or for a bad cause. So courage requires wisdom. Justice requires wisdom, because if you don't have wisdom, then you won't know what is owing to one person. You won't know what they talk about. Wisdom is correct distribution. We'll give someone, we'll give some worthless person, vast sums of money, and we won't give money to someone who's really deserving. So wisdom is required. So the same with moderation and self-control. How do you know what desires you should control if you don't? So I think the idea of the unity of the virtues is a very powerful idea, and it's I noticed in recent discussions in practical Stoicism, the idea of the four virtues is now very strong, and I'm glad about that. I think it's very good, but I think it's also important. To recognize the idea that we're trying to bring these together. Another important idea is that we're not wise. Okay, that's the Stoics reference. Sometimes people think, I've just the four virtues as a sort of ready reckoning device, and I can get the four virtues and I can become virtuous and then I can act properly. Well, no, it's not like that. It's a journey. We're working towards. We're trying to make progress. We don't have the virtues, but we can work towards them. We can form a view about what they are. We can form an understanding of them, and they can then, and we can work towards this unity of the virtues. So I think there's two things that's very important: the unity and also the aspirational element. Again, sometimes missed. Yes, and sometimes, one other thing, sometimes people think, Stoics, they're sort of, they think they're wonderful. They think they've got all the virtues and they just look down on everyone. No, that's the last thing they do. Yeah.
Okay, we have a question from Courtney, if you're happy, mate, do you want to express it yourself? I can summarize it, or I'm happy to let you do that work.
Oh, you put it in your words, and they'll probably come out clearer. You're very good at speaking.
Well, I guess what I think you're asking is there a paradox, Chris, in saying that some indifferents are preferred? That is, other things be equal. We should try to select them. We should try to pursue them. On the other hand, there are passages which Courtney points out where Socrates and others say that, look, if a bad person gets these things, it's going to make their life a whole lot worse.
Sure.
Courtney could correct me if I haven't got the paradox, but that seems to me to be the
Well,
tension.
I think in Euthydemus, if I'm correct, he goes through that analysis that you were giving about you know, what good things do you need and all the rest of it, and he ends up saying that if a person's unwise and they get these indifferent things, then they're more likely to misuse them, and if they misuse them, they're more likely to do harm. So it would be, who is better off, the person without those indifferent things, or the person who has them and isn't able to use them wisely? And then he concludes that people who are unwise would be better off not having those indifferent things, because they wouldn't be able to do the harm that they would be, and so on. And you see the same sorts of things in Seneca and Epictetus. So I guess that, yeah, like you say, the question is, it's an interesting paradox, because it's not about necessarily getting your hands on these indifferent things, but fundamentally knowing how to use them. You'd be better off, in fact, if you never got your hands on them, if you were going to misuse them in the first place. That kind of idea.
Yes, there's a debate on this, precisely this question within Stoicism. And there's an early Stoic called Aristo who took the position that I think you're taking, is that there's no distinction between preferred and dispreferred indifference. They're just indifference. Okay, they're just indifference. And actually what we should be doing is working towards an attitude of indifference. He said this: virtue is being indifferent to indifference. So they should not matter to us at all. They shouldn't matter to us at all, whether we're healthy, whether we're rich. It doesn't matter. We've just got to be virtuous. And then the reply of that, which we know, Chrysippus, one of the great Stoic theorists, said was, hang on, if we have that attitude, then where are the decisions that we make in life? Where is the stuff of human life? That's putting virtue in a kind of void. So virtue is a kind of hovering in the air, but human life, we're not hovering in the air. We're confronted with situations where we have to choose between health or select health or illness. We have to make decisions about money. We have to make decisions about relationships. The stuff of human life. I mean, the indifferents are the kind of stuff of human life. They are the conditions of human life. And they're also things, the Stoics think, we are naturally inclined. Remember, we're leading the life according to nature. We're naturally inclined to do some things rather than other. We're designed to go for food, otherwise we die. We're designed to go to, we'd rather have a roof over our heads. We'd rather have a family than, these are natural to us. So another way of another term they used for the preferred indifference is the things according to nature. They're things that we naturally go to, that make up the substance of a human life. So so virtue can't be just practiced. It isn't as if we can say, well, I'll just shut everything out. I'll go into an empty room and just be virtuous. Well, hang on. That's not what we do in life. We're not in an empty room, or at least if we are, being in an empty room is a deliberate choice. There won't be any rooms if there's got to be so indifference. So that's why I think that the Chrysipian view is more convincing. It's more powerful, and I think part of it is just saying that virtue and indifference they're different categories. Philosophers sometimes talk about category mistakes. They're different categories. Virtue is a kind of expertise. Indifference are, as it were, the conditions. They're the things about which we decide. They're the things about which we exercise our. So it's not as if at any given moment you're saying, well, which shall I do? Go for indifference or go for virtue? Virtue is expressed in selection between indifference. That's why I've stressed so much this idea of virtue as expertise. So they are interdependent, they're conceptually interdependent. Does that help?
Yeah, it does. I guess to clarify a little bit, Seneca, for example, uses a quote from Demetrius, and he says, he can't imagine anyone more unhappy who has never experienced misfortune because they will never get to test themselves, you know. So that's where I was kind of going with it, is that maybe they'd preferred, of course, I want to have good health so I can be a better father and spend time with my family. But in the experience of having poor health, perhaps I'm made a better person by my having to confront what that's like for me and use and develop my character accordingly. So I guess that's the paradox. We might want the preferred things and go for them. Yeah.
Yes, but I think those are perfectly compatible. It's perfectly compatible to say we naturally prefer health, and also to say that we can learn to be virtuous by withstanding the loss of it. Those aren't, it's perhaps seemingly paradoxical, but it's not really paradoxical, I think. It's not as paradox, it's a different point from just giving indifference no value. It's just we just need to put these points together, I think.
Yeah, it's just a little bit like in the Stoic view on friendship, you know, the wise man will want to have as many friends as he can, but he will not need friends. He can have a happy life without friends. So it's, you know, those kind of things seem like a contradiction, but they're not actually. I know Courtney's got a second question, but I just want to ask Tyler Patus.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks, Chris. I've read almost all your book. I try to finish it all by tonight. I didn't quite get through the last chapter. Very, very helpful. But yeah, I wanted to pick up on this exact point about indifference, and actually specifically about friends. So preferred indifference don't make the difference to my well-being, but I have this social nature, and I could see the claim. It's very plausible that my happiness doesn't depend on any particular relationship or any particular other person. But is it consistent? Is there a problem with the idea of my happiness being completely independent of other people and other beings, to the extent that I really could be fully happy without any friends or even without any social interactions, given that being social is a key part of my nature?
Yes, I think that's a good question. Of course, a lot depends on what we mean by happy. Okay, so for the Stoics, happiness is leading a certain kind of life. It's leading the life according to nature. Now, I think what it would mean, what it takes to live that kind of life is that under normal circumstances, one would want friends. One would want to have friends, other people. Yes, one wants to have. It's natural to want to have other people. It's natural to want to form relationships, to have a family, to being deeply engaged with people. Yes, it is. But if you have to, first of all, lose a particular person, and this happens, or actually it happens to nearly all of us at some point or another, you can withstand it. You can withstand it, you know, with courage. And also, if you had to be on a desert island, I suppose this is the sort of classic one, you could stand that too. You could still exercise the virtues. Some of us more some of us would feel a bit of a lack of the practical virtues, but you could do it. So, but that's not incompatible. I mean, those things are not incompatible. You can be a social animal in principle. Your life can be one of full and social engagement in principle, and it can also be the case that if circumstances require, if you're imprisoned for your principles and convictions, as people are, in fact, and have to exist in solitary confinement, you can, and Stoicism will help you do that.
That's helpful. Thanks. Just one quick follow-up.
Yes.
Could that be, though, one of the circumstances in which it could be reasonable to end your own life? So I think you mentioned severe illness, but if I'm in permanent isolation on a desert island, could it be reasonable on a Stoic view to end my own life because I no longer have the opportunity to do my social virtue activities?
Yes. Well, it could, perhaps, but of course you can always say that I've lived a life as a social animal. This has informed and shaped my whole worldview and experience. I still feel, in some sense, part of the human race. Okay, it happens to be the case that I'm contingently alone, and that there's no ship on the horizon, and so on. But I'm still. It's if you like, made me the person. That part involvement has made me the person I am. It's given me the kind of worldview and understanding and emotions, and I have no reason to end that. It's still a worthwhile human life. Just as when we've lost someone, as another person that matters very much to us, their lives can still inform our lives and our understanding, and we can do what we can to live for them.
Thank you.
I'll just add, Tyler, if I may, to that point around ending one's own life. Towards the end of letter 58, Seneca has a very interesting passage about this very issue. And he says, if you've made yourself a person worth spending time with, it's a good idea to spend as much time with yourself as you can. So that's one thing. But he also says, if my faculties are attacked, if he's losing his faculties, essentially, he will leave the crumbling building, is the way he puts it. Now, in the event, things happened somewhat differently to that, but that was what he was meditating at that time. So I think that's an interesting way of thinking about it, and also a way that we today can also yes, identify with.
Yeah. Marcus says the same. He says that I hope I would have the courage to anticipate mental dementia.
Yeah,
quite tough, isn't
it? Just before we go to Courtney's got another question, and there's a couple of others. It's something I'm wrestling with. Virtue is the only good, and that's preeminently my own. Is your virtue the virtues of others? Is that part of the good? And it's a bit of a loaded question because I think there are passages I feel that sort of point both ways. But is that your understanding? Should we be thinking that it's not only my virtue, it's virtue itself, and therefore it's not necessarily my own? I have a logos, part of the logos. You have part of the logos. Yeah.
Yes, the Stoics say exactly that. That two wise people, two virtuous people, they're benefited by each other's virtue. They share that virtue. They participate in it. So it is a shared quality, and so yes, so it's not just my virtue. It's not got Christopher Gill written on it. It's virtue. I'm just sort of participating in something much bigger. And also, of course, when we say virtue, let's think there are four virtues. Courage and I know they're unified, but courage and justice. Well, how are we going to express these in a way that's completely self-centered or self-related? I mean, you can't, they are fundamental. These are, and all the virtues. How can you be wise if you have no sense of what's of social obligation and social connection? So I think the idea that, again, virtue is sort of something that hovers in the air. It doesn't hover in the air. It's linked with living and experience and relationships.
Thank you. All right, Courtney has a second question, and it concerns in particular Martha Nussbaum and her criticisms, I guess, critique of some aspects of Stoicism in therapy of desire. So Courtney writes, from a modern psychotherapy perspective, CBT has tried to show a clear alignment with Stoicism. Okay. But as a contrast, Nussbaum in therapy of desire gives a more psychoanalytic interpretation of the consequences of strong commitments to externals or external things, I guess, or people. She uses an object relations approach. What do you think of her analysis, i.e., that the world penetrates and contaminates our rational integrity?
Yes. Okay, well, Martha is very much an Aristotelian. I mean, that's her framework, really. And when she reads the Stoics, she's reading them with an Aristotelian lens in mind. And she says, well, hang on, Aristotle, and so that really informs everything. So when Aristotle will say, well, we've got to have virtue, but well, we also need other people, or we also need external goods to be really happy. So it's just quite a different framework. And I think Martha always doesn't, she doesn't see the force of the Stoic claim that virtue can, in some sense, incorporate these dimensions. So they just think, they both think other people are very important. They both think that, and they both give attention to other kinds of goods, but in a quite different way. I think that's really the difficulty, and and this argument, of course, between the Stoic and the Aristotelians has been going on a long time. It goes right back. Cicero's on ends. It's all about this. So it's a long argument, and never the twain shall meet. It sometimes seems, but you yeah. So I think that's what I'd say about Martha's view. But I don't want to replay all the many arguments that have gone on between the Stoic and the Aristotelian.
Can I ask a little more about that? Because that's very interesting.
How about we'll come back to you, Courtney, because we've got Krista's asked another question, which I know Tim has been engaging with in the chat, but I think this is a really interesting question. This idea of, well, the question of the meaning of life, which I think is a really, I don't know, it seems to be quite a specifically modern, I'm not aware of an ancient text that seems to ask this question, but Krista asks it, and the question is Stoicism related to the meaning of life?
Well,
do you have an angle on that, Christopher or Judy?
I think they do talk about the meaning of life. Well, what makes life worth living? That's the central question of Stoic ethics. What makes life worth living? What really matters? That's what the question of eudaimonia is. That's what the question of happiness. What is happiness? What really makes life living? What makes a human life worth living? What makes a natural life worth living? So it's their question. And of course, in the ancient world, different people give different answers. The Epicureans will say it's pleasure as they understand it. Aristotle will say it's virtue plus, things going okay. And the Stoics say it's virtue. So the meaning of life is very much their question. But they don't put it up. The meaning of life is a slightly odd question, isn't it? Because it implies that there is it's a kind of puzzle and there's a meaning, but they don't quite put it like that. But what's the telos? What's the goal of a human life? That's in a way, that's a meaning of life question.
Maybe Tim, would you like to comment on that?
Judy, do you want to?
Oh, sorry.
Tim's jumped in.
Yeah, Tim, did you want to comment? Because you've just commented in the chat that in Stoic Week, there's a meaning scale this time as well as a Stoicism scale. So maybe, did you want to offer a few comments on that, Tim?
Yeah, so it's really interesting because people have from time to time said, hey, how about, as in the question, what about meaning in life? It's something that certainly of interest. So Martin Seligman, who proposed this idea of PERMA as a well-being framework, has got meaning as one of the 5 things. Now, obviously, the Stoics wouldn't quite agree with that, but the question is Stoicism conducive to meaning and purpose in life? And again, meaning is one of these slippery topics. It sometimes means having a purpose. Sometimes it means making a difference. It can mean a sense of belonging, for instance. Those are 3 different things about meaning. And we tend to talk about meaning in life these days rather than the meaning of life. So Gary Brown, who's a researcher who we're working with this year in Stoic Week, has his scale is called a measurement of mundane meaning, and we put it in with the SAB scale, which is a measurement of Stoicism, and just seeing if they're related. And our hypothesis is that there is going to be a high correlation between them. And just analysing the results that have come up from the start of Stoic Week, and that seems to be the case. So I know there are deeper philosophical and historical questions which Chris has been addressing, but just from a purely psychometric point of view, I think we can say that at the start of Stoic Week, there's a high correlation between concepts like meaning, purpose, belonging, and Stoicism. What we'll find out at the end of Stoic Week is whether living like a Stoic for a week has any impact on that. And again, my hypothesis is it will. But that's just living like a Stoic for a week. What if we live like a Stoic for longer? Probably a bigger effect.
Thanks, Tim. I look forward to seeing the results. It'll be fascinating. Courtney, do you want to jump back in?
Oh, now I'm worried about asking my question. Now my question.
This is a welcoming space, my friend. Please.
I'm trying to work out how to ask it right. Okay, I'm trying. Okay, so some people will say that cognitive behavioral therapy is like the therapy, modern psychotherapy par excellence, and it kind of aligns very well with Stoicism, and that Stoicism is a neat little booster to boost cognitive behavioral therapy in the therapy room. I was just wondering, well, I'm not, see, this is where it's a tricky question, really, because I know they're completely different subjects, but the idea would be that Stoicism probably should be treated on its own, and it has its own agenda, doing its own thing in a completely different way than modern psychotherapy does things. So how justified, I guess, is CBT in being able to make claims that Stoicism is kind of a prototype to CBT? And it links into my Nussbaum question, I guess, that if someone else can make a claim that object relationship is a good fit for Stoicism, for example, as a psychological kind of paradigm, then I guess yeah, who has the better claim, the psychoanalyst or the cognitive behavioral therapist? Or should we just leave Stoicism alone as a philosophy of life? I guess that kind of question. Does that make sense?
Yes. Okay. Well, I'll say something, and perhaps Tim could say something since he is a CBT therapist. Yeah, it's a big question. Some CBT therapists, especially in the early days, pointed very much to Epictetus, especially as an inspiration, and especially Epictetus's view that we are affected emotionally not by events, but by our beliefs, our belief structure, our assumptions, our underlying assumptions, and so forth. And this proved extremely fruitful as a hypothesis, which CBT explored and developed, and still does develop and apply, I believe. Now, so now, actually, whether you can hold that view if you're also a psychoanalyst, I don't know. That's rather another, if you're a Freudian psychoanalyst, it's another question. But it's certainly proved. It's proved, and of course, there's a great deal of sort of evidence-based work done on this. This has proved an incredibly fruitful hypothesis that to articulate your underlying cognitions, this can help you, and it's helping actually lots and lots of people at this moment as we speak. So now Stoicism, of course, Stoicism has much broader and more complex claims. It's not just about the motivation of action. It's about all sorts of other things. But I think there's a very and of course it's much more ethical in a kind of explicitly ethical. And CBT therapists like Tim, they might have ethical views, but they're not meant to be telling their clients, how to live morally. I mean, that's not, thing. But Stoicism is actually so. There are differences, but also some very interesting, powerful overlaps. I think that have proved very fruitful, that have really made a difference. And I mean, what does philosophy want to do if it doesn't, want to make a difference to life? Yeah, Tim, what do you think?
Yeah, I've got to go in literally 2 minutes because I've got a meeting, but that's a great answer, Chris. And I'll just very quickly add two things. I completely agree with everything you say in what you just said. So sometimes, if it hadn't been for CBT, some of the claims that the Stoics make, like, it's interpretations or judgments that count and not events themselves, would be much less credible. So I think CBT provides very good evidence that major parts of Stoicism, particularly the part foregrounded, emphasized by Epictetus, actually work in the real world. So I think that's a very important point. Now, CBT's gone on, and it's particularly Beckian CBT. It's very diagnostic based, and so what they've gone along is develop protocols for particular mental health disorders. And so modern CBT isn't the same as Stoicism. It's kind of just gone off. It's kind of, you'll still see parts of Stoicism there. It's not like it's completely different, but it's a development of. And if you did CBT for depression, you'd be focusing probably on behavior more than thinking, at least to start with. So I've kind of developed a little mantra, which is Stoicism is for eudaimonia and CBT is for mental health problems. And I think that's kind of helpful, really. And again, the second thing to say is that, of course, Stoicism, as you said, Chris, is much broader, focusing on happiness, flourishing, eudaimonia, the ethical framework. So there's more to CBT than Stoicism. There's more to Stoicism than CBT. I think there's a big overlap, and in a way they support each other. And I would suspect that psychoanalysis and object relations, there would probably be some overlap, but much less of an overlap. So I guess I'm kind of slightly disagreeing with the original questioner that CBT is kind of claiming Stoicism. It's kind of, initially Beck and Ellis said, hey, Stoics have done this. But if we said to modern CBT practitioners, hey, you're very different to Stoicism, and they'd say, so what? They're not kind of particularly. In fact, it's more the other way around. I think now that Stoicism is kind of, me as a Stoic CBT therapist is trying to build connections between the two in the communities. I have to go now. It's been a fascinating discussion. Is it being recorded, and can it be sent to us, Matthew? This discussion?
And yes.
Brilliant.
Thank you, Tim.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Judith.
Cheers.
And Chris and Matt. I've got to go now, but lovely to see you all. Bye.
Got one last question. It kind of picks up a little bit on what maybe part of what Tim was saying. And the question is Stoicism, and I'm sorry, I don't know your name, but if I misread this question wildly, please just pull me up. Is Stoicism an attempt to build a framework around oneself in the dualistic nature of life, which if everyone builds well, will benefit the whole society? Is that how we might understand, for example, the difference between a philosophy of life, such as Stoicism, perhaps, and a kind of therapeutic psychology? And Chris, by the way, is the person in the world who I would ask this question to, because he's done in the 90s, from the 90s onwards, he's worked on ancient conceptions of therapeutic philosophy and the differences. So, Chris, is Stoicism, is the more in Stoicism perhaps to do with this framework, to building self and building community?
Yes, I mean, modern therapy is addressing people who have problems, who find difficulty in coping. Stoicism addressing anyone, anybody. That it's saying, it's raising questions which are meaningful to everyone at every stage and form of their life. What makes life worth living? What is, as we were saying before, what is the goal? What is it to be human? Now, these are questions which have a much broader focus. They can also be helpful. The way in which Stoicism can be helpful, I'm sure, to people in distress, and through history, they've helped people enormously who are in distress and help them find a pathway too. But it addresses anyone. That someone who might have just triumphed in the world, I think it'd be good for that person to, the Stoic would tell them to remind them that they are mortal. So it addresses everyone, and it addresses everyone at every stage of life. So it's much more universal, really. But it's nonetheless, in its universality, it can also help to heal, to give healing and comfort when we need it. But it's sometimes quite a tough comfort, but that can be the best we for us. Does that help at all? Thank you.
Thank you, Tabitha, and thank you, Chris. And that might be as good a note as pretty much any to finish. We have reached the end of the 2 hours. So please join me in thanking Christopher and Judy for this session. It's been fantastic.
It's been great.
Yeah, it has been recorded. It will be available through possibly through Modern Stoicism, it sounds like. Thank you again for your excellent questions and discussion. And yeah, I guess I don't have anything more to say at this point. Judy, do you want to add anything at this point?
No, just to particularly thank Chris and you, Matt. It's been a wonderful session, and thanks to everyone who's come along.
Yes, I'd like to thank everyone. All of these really interesting questions, searching, profound and interesting questions. It's been a wonderful dialogue. So thank you.
Thanks very much, Chris. It's always a pleasure, and well done on the book. It's a really significant, as Judy has said, I think, contribution, and will be for some time. So
thanks.
It's fantastic to be able to discuss it. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right.
Cheers. Have a good day, evening. Thank you.
Bye.
Hello.